Welcome back to Starkiller Base. Today is the first installment of our new Metawatch video series. This is a series of videos that explores the different types of decks that you're likely to see when you attend a tournament. Obviously the meta is constantly changing, but these are some of the top decks I've seen in our current Way of the Force meta. The first deck we're going to look at is Cad Snoke. This deck plays a lot like a Sabine deck, except for the fact that Cad Bane's ability is actually reasonable, since it requires you to play an upgrade from your hand and not from your discard pile. The premise behind the deck is the same as most other Cad Bane decks we've seen from him in the past, except this one has you use Cad Bane's action to play an ambush weapon on him, activate him, and then you have another action. Typically this action will be to use Snoke's power action on one of Cad's character dice, ideally doing 4 or 5 damage. If you're playing against a deck that has nasty events or supports like a vehicle deck, you can also resolve the 2 discard side for 4 and completely gut your opponent's turn. Discarding 4 cards from a vehicle deck's hand turn 1 is absolutely devastating, I can assure you. In general, I find that this deck does well if it rolls well and loses if it does not. Sound familiar? Of course it does! Destiny's had those decks since Awakenings was released with Django Veers. There are cards in the deck that help with consistency, of course, and most of them have ambush to keep the unmitigable dice rolling. Roll in Cad after spending all your money on an LL30 and you just roll to pay side? Play Truce and get that resource and take another action. Roll in and get a pile of garbage? Play Take Flight for a reroll and take another action. Like most smoked decks, you'll want to kill Snoke last. Snoke is helping you kill Cad in this deck, so why not just give him a hand? Do note that Snoke's power action only works on character dice and only on other character dice. When choosing what dice to control, you want to prioritize Cad's character dice if Snoke hasn't used his power action for the round. When Cad dies, the action cheating is gone. Any spotty yellow cards are cleared, and since this is a villain, you don't have to worry about second chance ruining your plans when you try to kill Cad first. Snoke, with whatever redeploy weapons Cad had on when he died, is a lot easier to deal with, but you should not underestimate his dice either. In a heads-up battle, a 2 indirect is still 2 damage on your only character, and you can expect his focus size to ensure that the upgrades left on him are turned to the sides he's looking for. Our next deck is Kylo Snoke. See a pattern forming yet? Snoke is a cheap character that can enable some pretty powerful plays. Much like all Kylo decks, this deck is going to be full of melee weapons and die control. The main difference is that Kylo's supporting character isn't doing damage directly, whereas in a Kylo Talzin or Kylo Anakin deck they would be. Snoke adds consistency with his dice, since he's got 2 focus sides, and he supports Kylo's damage with his power action. There isn't really any action cheating in the deck like there is in Cad Snoke, but once Snoke has 1 or 2 force speeds on him, you can expect him to be rolled in first, then he'll resolve a 4 speed special to take multiple actions, roll in Kylo, use his ability to try to hit you for 2 damage, and then resolve one of Kylo's dice, which have damage on 50% of their sides by the way, with Snoke's power action. Kylo's definitely the one that needs to die first in this deck, as he's going to be doing the vast majority of the damage. Once he dies, Snoke is a pussycat once again, and there's generally even less redeploy in this deck than a Cad Snoke deck. You'll definitely want to be mindful anytime this deck has 5 resources, because healing Kylo for 5 and slapping a Dagger of Mortis on him by using Rise Again is a pretty brutal play. If you're piloting this deck, it can be worth it to use Snoke's power action on Kylo's resource side to get up to the 5 resources and play that card. If Kylo dies, you'll also want to watch out for Dark Ritual to bring him back. Having him come back with 6 hit points left is pretty rough. So try to take him down again as soon as you see him come back. Next up we have Kylo Price. Kylo is definitely becoming a staple in a lot of villain decks, and Price is another of the new villain support characters. Where Snoke's support comes from his power action, Price's comes from the special side on her dice. This allows you to change another one of your dice to any side, basically functioning like a single focus die, with the exception that it enables special chaining. The ability goes on further to say that if you control the battlefield, that you can also immediately resolve the die, increasing its value by 1. This would allow you to resolve Price's special to turn an heirloom saber die from a blank to a 3 melee, and resolve her 4 immediately if you control the battlefield. Without having Emperor's Throne Room as the active battlefield, I found Price to be rather underwhelming. Oftentimes, particularly early in the game, you'll have resolved most of your other dice and only have a Price special and maybe 1 other die remaining, or your dice have already rolled what you're looking for and the Price's special doesn't do much. You need to keep in mind that when resolving Price's special or the throne room that you must turn the die to another side. If the heirloom die is already a 3 melee, you can't turn it to the 3 melee and then resolve it for 4 because it's already at the 3 melee. Luckily with Price's die, she has 2 special sides, so you can claim and use the throne room to resolve one of her dice even when it's already showing a special because you just turn it to the other special side. Aside from these nuances, the deck is a pretty typical Kylo deck, short of the fact that it has some protection against enemy Kylo decks with the inclusion of red cards and a decent number of gray cards. It also has some fan favorites like the Best Defense and Tactical Mastery to help out. Next, we have a deck that I first saw on the Your Destiny podcast. This one is Thrawn Snoke. Thrawn has definitely been one of the coolest and most interesting characters in Destiny since he came out in Empire at War. After Ankar's cost was increased, we've only really seen him paired with Mother Talzin, and to limited success. The Thrawn Snoke deck is making some waves now as a vehicle deck, and it looks like a lot of fun. The premise of the deck is to use Snoke and Thrawn to make tons of money and play at expensive vehicles and high-impact events. Something as simple as rolling in Thrawn, using Snoke's power action to resolve his 2 resource side for 4 resources, and then playing a 6-cost support like Planetary Bombardment or an ATST turn 1 can definitely set the tone of the game. While Snoke and Thrawn's dice won't be doing much in the way of damage, they can generate money and add some serious consistency with focus chaining to get the most out of those support dice. If you can stop the deck from generating money early by mitigating Thrawn's dice or the chance cube, then you can slow down the ramp of this deck significantly. Otherwise, I would just focus on controlling the most dangerous support die you see on the table. The inclusion of the First Order TIE Fighter can ruin the plans of any deck that relies on shields, and the rest of the support dice just tend to do silly amounts of damage. Thrawn's character ability is a tricky one unless you know your matchup, but when used correctly it can change the tide of the game. Dark Ritual is an amazing card in this deck, as it allows you to bring back those big health characters to give the deck another round or 2 of rolling in those big supports. Much like other vehicle decks, any decks that can resolve their dice quickly and play retreat or hyperspace jump to end the round can devastate a turn. Thrawn should keep this in mind, and once a decent number of supports have been played out, call the appropriate number to ensure that he doesn't lose a turn to one of these cards. Cards to watch out for in this deck, aside from Dark Ritual, include Planetary Bombardment and the Hailfire Droid Tank. Planetary is an absolutely devastating card in this deck, having 4 damage sizes that range from 4 to 7. Imagine playing against this deck and having Snoke focus both Planetary Bombardment dice to 7 indirect damages. Short of playing easy pickings, there are a very limited number of ways that can deal with those dice. It may be wise to mitigate them as they come in, even before they're focused or fixed, to ensure that you can remove the dice before they fire. Most 2-character lists only have 21 to 23 hit points, so taking 3 of these is pretty much game over. The Hailfire Droid Tank is a cheaper but just as deadly companion. It also has 4 damage sides, and while smaller, some of them are ranged so they can be directed, so watch out for that. It also has an ability which has you taking passive indirect damage when vehicles are played. One note about the Art of War. This card is a very powerful card, but it does have a downside. The card reads, spot a red character to reveal an opponent's hand. For each card you just revealed, remove a die showing a value that is equal to that card's cost. Note that it does not say to remove an opponent's die showing that value. This means that if your opponent has a 2-cost card in their hand and only you have a 2-value die, you're forced to remove your own dice. Thankfully, there aren't any 7-cost cards to make you have to remove your own Planetary Bombardment, eh? Luke may be one of the most powerful characters included in Way of the Force. At a 12-15 with 12 hit points and 3 effective damage sides in his dice, he is one nasty dude. Most decks right now don't even use Luke's power action and focus on playing melee upgrades like we've seen in the past with Rey Ayla decks and the like. Luke's passive ability to resolve his shield dice as melee has many upsides, as a lot of the die control cards in the game specifically reference dice showing damage, and Luke's shield size are not damage. They also do a great job of enabling cards like Synchronicity, and your eyes can deceive you given that they got so many shields. The downside is that they aren't showing melee damage, so you can't use them with cards like Guard, and you can't use Force Misdirection to call melee with a Luke die. I've found that the advantages outweigh the disadvantages in this case, particularly given that almost every other die in the deck has plenty of melee sides. I don't think there's anything revolutionary in this deck. Lots of shields, lots of melee, and you can resolve Luke's dice as damage if you need it, or shields if one of your characters are about to die. I've gone from including Caution in my 2-character decks like this one to using Pacify instead. The reason for this is that Pacify is never a dead card, whereas if you lose one of your characters, Caution is. Pacify can also be used in more cases, as you can actually remove one of your opponent's character dice with it. You do give them shields, but sometimes it's worth it, particularly if they already have 3 shields in that character. In this particular iteration of the deck, you'll notice Makashi Training. Not only does this upgrade give you some die mitigation with its ability, but it's also an ability upgrade. This allows Luke to play it on himself, roll it in, resolve the die, and then power action it to Rey and use it again in the same round. It's sort of limited in some cases, but hey, why not, right? Other iterations of this deck might include Ayla with a plot, and more upgrades that have specials like the Light Bow, or Luke with Yoda using It Binds All Things, Luke's Training, and other cards to maximize the effectiveness of blue ability upgrades like Force Throw. I do think that Rey to Luke 3 is probably the most consistent version of these decks, however. Next up, we have the Clone Squad. Ever since Rex was spoiled with Bendu's Lair, people were excited to try this one out. I have to admit, I didn't really consider building it because I figured it was more of a fun deck than a tier 1 deck. I ran into it last Friday in a local tournament and found out how scary it actually was. I managed to pull off the win regardless, but it was by far the closest game I had that night. The premise behind the deck is to leverage Rex's ability to do all sorts of fun things. When you activate Rex, you can pay 1 or spot a clone trooper to take control of the battlefield. This makes cards like Defensive Position and Dug In far more consistent. Add in some Rex's Blaster Pistol, which allows you to roll in a second character after activating the attached character as long as you control the battlefield, and things can get really interesting. In an ideal case, you have Rex with 2 blasters, you play Hit and Run, activate Rex to take control of the battlefield if you don't already have it, then use his blasters to activate each clone trooper in turn, using their abilities to reroll a character die each. And on top of all that, you have an ambush action. Given that most of the dice in this deck have damage on 50% of their sides, you're likely to dish out some serious pain with a play like this. The healing in this deck can get pretty nutty as well. Remember looking at First Aid and saying, boy, it's too bad this only works on red characters? Well, what if your entire list included only red characters? Now you're basically running 4 copies of Field Medic, except 2 of them can heal 4 damage if they come out on turn 1. On top of all that, throw in some Medical Center to heal more when you claim, and you gladly give control of the battlefield away since Rex can get it right back. Aside from First Aid, this deck can also run Suppressive Fire, which puts a wrench in the plans of most decks that have action cheating. I'm looking at you, Sabine and Cad. When playing against the deck, you'll want to kill Rex first since he's the one enabling most of the annoying antics that come with it, but sometimes it's just really hard to manage that task. Next we have DJ decks. The first one you're likely to see is DJ Phasma. DJ doesn't really bring anything revolutionary to the table, but his dice are pretty solid, and his ability to deal indirect damage when he removes your dice can add it pretty quickly. When I first saw him, I thought it would be really cool to run Streetwise, and then just play a whole bunch of yellow die control cards that remove multiple dice, and then I realized that there actually aren't that many that do that, unfortunately. So you'd either have to run him with a character that generates a lot of money, or go another way. This deck is a pretty typical yellow-red ranged villain style deck. Blasters, redeploy, bait and switch, all the good stuff. One upgrade that I think is really great from Way of the Force is the Mandalorian Van Braces. They're not a high impact upgrade, so they won't make a lot of waves, but a 1-cost die with no blanks and the ability to pick it back up and put it in your hand is pretty amazing. Another iteration of the deck I've seen played is DJ with Talzin. The deck does go for a lot of odd numbered cards to enable the consistency seen in Talzin decks. You can also run the Rift Valley battlefield, which lets you remove a die when you claim if the top card of your deck is odd. This may not seem too amazing, but if your deck is built with odd cards and you couple that with DJ's ability, you can remove a 2 melee damage side and then have DJ's ability to do 1 indirect damage to your opponent. That's a pretty good swing. The next deck archetype to look at is 3 or 4 character vehicle decks. The premise behind all these decks is to put out a lot of cheap vehicles to deal damage while your characters take hits and hopefully survive long enough for the vehicles to kill your opponent. These decks are generally weak against mill decks, so be careful if you plan to bring one of them to a store championship. Generally, they run few to no upgrades and focus on die control, economy, survivability, and vehicles. This list won a store championship recently with Elite Rose and 2 Jetta Partisans. Elite Rose, Partisan, and Wedge also won a store championship. Having 2 yellow characters allows you to run cards like Second Chance, Easy Pickings, and Entangle with less worry that you'll have no yellow characters to spot. Given that Rose has nearly the same number of hit points but 2 dice and some serious economy due to her special sides, she's almost always going to be the first target. This lets you happily play your spotty yellow cards without having to worry about them ending up as dead cards in your hand. The first notable card in this deck is Long-Term Plan. This plot allows you to take an action to place a resource on it from the supply, or to resolve a die and increase its value by the number of resources on the plot. The idea behind the card is that for the first 2 turns or so, you use the action to put a couple of resources on it. Then from turn 3 and on, you use it to resolve a damage die and increase its value by 2. Given that Games of Destiny typically last 4 to 5 turns, you don't want to spend too much time stacking resources on Long-Term Plan. The other notable card is the Resistance Crate Speeder. On the surface, it doesn't look like much. It's a vehicle, it costs 2, it has 3 damage sides, and an ability that lets you increase the value on the die by 1 once per game. That is, unless you find a way to remove the damage on the support because you could repeat the ability, right? It just happens that Rose's special removes damage from supports, so as long as she's resolving her specials, you can resolve this die for +1 several times. On top of that, because the ability is a before ability, you can use it in conjunction with Long-Term Plan. If you rolled a 2 on the speeder, you could resolve it for 5 damage. Not bad for a 2-cost support. It also happens to have no modified or pay sides. This one easily replaces the modified HWK from previous vehicle decks, which were basically dead cards in your hand if Rose had already been killed and couldn't remove the damage from them. When playing a vehicle deck, if you can kill off their only yellow character early, you've made your job a lot easier. Watch out for easy pickings. If you have ways to change your dice, you may not want to set them to the same side to avoid that happening. Resolving discard sides can be key against these types of decks as well, as their character dice don't typically do as much damage as an aggro deck, and keeping them poor can devastate them because they need their money to play out those supports. Next, we have the most feared and misunderstood archetype in Destiny, the dreaded Mill deck. While Villain Mill hasn't been doing much lately, Hero Mill has had some legs. With the inclusion of Yoda and now Leia and Cassian, things are starting to get a lot more spicy. The issues that Hero Mill had in the past is that while you can absolutely destroy your opponent's deck, they've always had trouble removing cards from your hand, short of using something like C-3PO with the Chance Cube anyway. Now we see characters like Cassian who not only have 2 discard sides on his character dice, but also have a passive ability that mills off of your opponent's deck when you resolve his dice. Yoda's dice have always been great, as well as versatile. He can get you money, shields, or even mill from your opponent's deck. Typically, a mill deck will run few upgrades and rely on events to keep their characters alive and mitigate dice. The main question when building a mill deck is, do you go for 2 characters with 20 or so hit points and hope to mill someone fast enough that you don't die? Or do you go for a 3 character list like Elite Yoda, Cassian, and Jar Jar to add some extra hit points in the hopes that it'll be enough? One of the main benefits of running a mill deck is that most people simply don't know how to play against them. They do things differently than almost every other archetype. I've seen people play a card and spend a resource to remove a die when playing against a mill deck that just discards a card. Why would you use a card and a resource to prevent the loss of a card? People also resolve shield sides sometimes, which makes no sense except in edge cases where you run riposte in your deck and want to get that extra damage off. When playing a mill deck, you have to think of your deck as your hit points. You've got 30 hit points when you start the game. The problem is that you likely won't win the game unless you play some of your cards. So the trick is to find a balance between conserving cards and using them in the right circumstances. If you can discard a card to reroll 2 dice and hopefully squeeze out an extra damage, it might not be worth it depending on how many cards you've got left. You could use that same card the next round to reroll 8 dice and most likely have a much better return. You'll also find that many of your cards become useless against mill decks, such as those that heal damage or make shields or remove dice showing damage sides, though you can still use those against Cassian's dice at least. When those cards get milled, it's not as big a deal as losing an upgrade or a card that deals damage directly. The problem that mill decks have is that they're disadvantaged when it comes to your game going to time in a tournament. The first tiebreaker is the amount of damage done. If you've got 1 card left in your hand and you do 3 damage to the mill deck, and the mill deck is then no damage to you, you win even though you were getting destroyed in the game. Because of this problem, many players avoid playing mill decks in larger tournaments. If I sat down across from you and added 10 seconds to every one of my decisions, it would be very hard for you to call a judge on me for slow playing, but it would also be very hard for us to complete our game in 35 minutes, causing my aggro deck to beat your mill deck at time. I do think this is a problem in the game since mill is supposed to be a valid victory condition, but I'm not sure what the solution to the problem should be. There's also the fact that when you're playing against a mill deck, if they're doing their job right, you'll end up frustrated and miserable. It's not exactly a great selling point for the game. Mill decks have done well recently, including E-Yoda, E-Cassian, E-Yoda, Cassian and Jar Jar, Cassian and Leia, and basically anything with Cassian in it. Some new cards to watch out for in mill decks. Dex's Diner can end up healing 6 to 10 damage a game if things work out for the mill deck. If it becomes rampant, it might be worthwhile including vandalizing your deck just to get rid of it. Another one is In the Crosshairs. This one functions similarly to Force Misdirection, except without the requirement for you to have any blue dice at all. You just pay 3, choose a symbol, and remove any number of dice showing that symbol. While DJ might love the card, because he can do indirect damage for every die removed, you may not like it when someone plays it against you. If you suspect your opponent has this card in hand, resolve your dice piecemeal, rather than rolling in all your characters and re-rolling until you get a bunch of damage sides. I have included links to the deck lists used in this video in the description below. If you'd like to check them out or ask any questions to the authors on swdestinydb.com, feel free to do so. There are a ton of competitive decks out there, and this list certainly doesn't cover all of them, but I do hope you found the video useful and insightful when preparing for your upcoming Destiny tournaments. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time on Starkiller Base.